Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Um, just broadly, so the 5% procurement target is considered a minimum, correct, rather than a maximum value?
Correct.
So what are the best practices undertaken by organizations that exceed that 5% target?
So I don't know their best practices. I know that we are trying to develop best practices, and we are aiming to increase the number of Indigenous firms that are participating in our contracts by either directing, making sure that Indigenous firms are part of the discussion we're having with other government departments when we're looking at their requirements, so that we could possibly direct it or put different measures in place to ensure that Indigenous businesses actually participate in our procurement activities.
And just through your opinion, your expertise, as you've been in this role, do you think this 5% target is a good thing, and that it's fostered that economic reconciliation that we've been trying to achieve?
Yes, I think it is a good thing, and we are, we do want procurement to be part of that, to help from an economic perspective, the Indigenous communities, help through training, increasing jobs, and the more that there is participation in the federal government contracts, I think the more Indigenous firms will participate in more and more of our contracts and will have some success. So I think the 5% is a start.
Great. And have you heard about personally, any evidence of wrongdoing or misrepresentation by Indigenous businesses listed on the Indigenous Business Directory?
I have not. And I think that, if there is something, I would strongly suggest that Indigenous Services Canada be communicated with, and they will have to look into it, because that is their role. I don't know, Clinton?
Yeah, no, I would agree. Thank you, Mr. President. I would also just add, in terms of the best practices point which you raised, which is really important. We found that working very closely with Indigenous communities are very important. They're able to help us identify businesses that could be best suited for certain procurements. We've certainly seen that through our work in the north of Canada, for example, with the Inuit. We work very closely with some of the economic development organizations that are rooted in the community. So working with partners that are from the community, critically important, and those departments that are establishing those connections are having success. And also from our side, in terms of the Government of Canada side, getting ahead of the curve in terms of identifying those procurements that would be well placed for Indigenous participation, getting out to the communities, talking to the businesses, finding out if they're comfortable with what they need to do to be able to actively compete. One of the terms that we use, we want to get businesses able to be bid ready. And so that's where some of the work that we'll do with Indigenous firms will come into play. So if we get early notice, working with some departments and give us that kind of advance, we can get out, identify the community partners, work with the businesses that could be well placed, and make sure that when the actual procurement hits the street, we're going to have success. And we've had success in every region in terms of Indigenous firms that we can speak to that have been successful. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I guess what I'm alluding to as well is that there's some broad claims being made in some of the preambles to the questions being asked by some of my committee members, and I'm just wondering if they know something more than we know, as far as which businesses are we talking about, as far as those that are non-compliant, or like there's evidence that we need to uncover, and I don't think that we've done that, and so I really thank you for what you've been able to bring to the table today, is with regards to broad procurement policy, and what PSBC is doing on their side to really encourage that participation for Indigenous businesses. I love hearing about the outreach, the networking, visiting communities, specifically those remote locations. All of that is critically important, and I think it speaks to the role that to the mandate that the government has put forward in that very important relationship that we have with Indigenous peoples, and having economic reconciliation be just a key pillar of that. So I'm just grateful for the discussion today, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Mrs. Atwin. We'll go to Mr. Lawrence. Welcome back to OGO, Mr. Lawrence. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I must admit, I'm not a normal member of this committee, and I've been sort of watching this with some awe at the lack of accountability with respect to your department, Ms. Paquette. Um, could you tell me if you feel your department is doing an adequate job detecting irregularities and even fraud within Indigenous procurement?
We put contracts in place, and if the contracts are for delivery of services or for goods, and as long as those services and those goods are delivered, that is the main concern. If a company is certified by the Indigenous Services Canada and they've met the certification requirements of Indigenous Services Canada, there is no fraud, as you've pointed out, and they are delivering their services or their goods to either PSPC or another government department.
Can you tell me how many contracts specifically dealing with Indigenous procurement that your department has stopped because of unfulfilling contractual obligations that your department has put out?
I don't have that information.
Could you provide that information to our committee?
If we have that information, yes.
So you may not have the information as to whether how many contracts have been stopped because of individuals not fulfilling or companies not fulfilling their obligations. That's possible.
We will provide the information. I don't know if we have it specifically stated that way. There are various, anyways, we will look into it.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you have not hit the 5% target. That's correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you. My fault. Yeah. A little delay there in the translation. But where are you at? What percentage are you at right now?
So we hit 2.7% in 22-23, and we had 3.4% or 143 million in 23-24. And I do not have the numbers for 24-25, but my understanding is a lot of the efforts through the engagement and increased participation in different activities in our procurement, we're getting close to our target of the 5%. But I don't have the number yet for this year because the year's not finished.
Excuse me, my apologies for over talking there to the translators. But have those numbers ever been audited?
I don't know. I would have to validate that. What do you mean by validate? Like audited? We have identified, so the companies that have been certified by IBD would be part of these contracts, and those contracts constitute the numbers we're able to identify towards the 5%.
So the question I'm looking at is was raised by Mr. Bachrach, is that these numbers, well, any number won't really matter if they're not stood up with a rigor. And so I'm just wondering if any independent review has been done, or even within the department to review, to see whether the procurement is occurring in accordance with yourselves as well as Indigenous services as well.
So the contract itself, we would be managing whether the contractor is delivering the good or service and they're meeting the requirements of the contract. The company would have been certified by the Indigenous Services Canada, be part of the IBD. That certification and the validation through the IBD allows us to actually give a contract to that company and count them against the 5% target.
So has your department stopped any contracts because of an issue with certification?
Not that I'm aware of. We would have to look into that.
Thank you. So that is our time. Maybe you can get back to us in writing with that.
Yes.
Mr. Baines for 5 minutes, please, and then we'll finish up with Mrs. Vignola and Mr. Backrack. Go ahead, Mr. Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We received in previous meeting, we received a letter to the committee um, from one of the organizations, and it indicated that with an effective Indigenous procurement system in place, the government could make tremendous steps forward toward economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So, what is, in your view, what is the significance of achieving economic reconciliation in Canada?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would say that economic reconciliation is critically important. It's important for Indigenous communities, and it's also an opportunity for them to be able to actively participate in federal procurement. We know that we're talking about quite significant numbers in terms of the level of procurement activity. And if we look at that sort of 5% target, and it's probably been mentioned, but we do look at it as a floor, not a ceiling. If you're able to really achieve that success, then we're talking about significant levels of investment that are going to be able to go into Indigenous communities, and it would be evident that the impact would be transformational. So we think it's critically important to really drive forward and see if we can make this target a reality. And as mentioned, we are working with partners. We're working with businesses. It's a collective Government of Canada effort. But if we're able to really make progress towards that 5%, it will have changes. I know that at the level of an individual enterprise level, when I work with or when our team rather works with a business, like for example an Indigenous business called Create a Fire, who does really amazing work in the communication space, and they've been working with our teams in Procurement Assistance Canada. They were able to apply to some of our instruments and fortunately get some success. And they certainly know that in terms of their business model, it's been quite incredible in terms of being able to increase the number of staff and able to have more of an impact. So we can see positive impacts at the firm level, and we think at the community level as well. So in my view, economic reconciliation is critically important. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And yeah, so like I can talk a little bit about locally here. Boeing in Richmond, British Columbia, made a significant investment of over $40 million, and one of the suppliers that was brought on to provide fabrication of machinery and national defense parts and supplies for our submarines was also one of the recipients, and I think that we've seen significant benefits here locally here in our region. Maybe if you can maybe expand a little bit about how ensuring procurement opportunities for Indigenous businesses help achieve economic reconciliation in Canada, and speak about if you've witnessed, we've talked a lot about the 5% target, but if you've witnessed anything in your departments where we've exceeded that 5% minimum threshold.
So I can actually give one example. So Atlantic Science Enterprise Center project. Within that actual procurement context, there are two large contracts for the Atlantic Science Enterprise Center project, which include Indigenous participation. And through those two particular contracts in particular, we were able to exceed the 5%. I don't have the actual total value of the contract, but so far through their efforts, those two contractors have provided close to $60 million through subcontracting with Indigenous businesses. And so that's a good news story. We also know that through the Canadian Dental Care Plan, Sun Life did have
I'm afraid that is our time. I have to cut you off because we're running short of time. Mrs. Vignola, please go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Beckett, I'd like to come back to what you just said and subcontractors. Some have already mentioned that there are Indigenous businesses that could be shell companies for non-Indigenous businesses. We've heard that sometimes it is necessary to go through a non-Indigenous business, but in your calculations on the value of contracts, when an Indigenous business is subcontracted, do you factor in the entirety of the contract or only the percentage awarded to that business? That is a great question. I don't have the answer, but I believe that it would be with the subcontracting company that would be a part of the 5% and not the entirety of the contract. We can only factor in the subcontractor if they're part of the directory, and that would be the value that could be included in the 5%, but I would need to verify this. If you could send us the answer in writing, that would be great. I'd like to come back on the report on the 5% targets. In 2022-2023, it stated that 28 organizations had not met the target of 5%. What is PSPC's role in supporting organizations in reaching that goal? That's my first question. And secondly, are there any consequences if one does not meet the goal of 5%? This goal was created by Indigenous Services Canada, not PSPC. We want to develop tools, for example, supply arrangements. So we develop those tools, and we can help with that because there are pools where Indigenous businesses would be part of them, and departments could look in there to use those businesses to meet their goals.
Time. Mr. Backrack, if you could finish off the day for us, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll pick up where I left off with my last round of questioning. Our witness from Procurement Assistance Canada indicated that his organization works closely with regional partners, and I'm curious in the Northwest BC context if he could share with us some of those partners that his organization has worked closely with.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. With our organization, we do work with local organizations. One of our key partners that we do work with is the Canadian Association of Native Development Officers. But in terms of directly with BC through our regional office, we do make sure that we're connecting locally with communities. If there was a requirement to maybe provide a list of some of the specific organizations that we've worked with, I'd be pleased to provide that.
Your regional office in British Columbia is located in Vancouver, correct?
That is correct.
Vancouver is the biggest city, the biggest urban center, and it's a long ways away from the region that I represent. I'm just curious whether you work with Pacifican, which has offices in Northwest BC, or with any local rural partners that are able to work on the ground with Indigenous businesses in more rural parts of the province?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. One of the models that we do, and it is actually widely implemented in BC and across the country. So I mentioned before that one of our key Indigenous partners is CANDO, Canadian Association of Native Development Officers, and it kind of speaks to the point that you raised. We don't have the full reach on the ground everywhere. So what we do with this association or this grouping, they are economic development professionals, and they are situated in the regions. So with this partnership, which is unique, we actually work with them. We share our learning instruments, our tools, and we basically teach them how to deliver the kinds of support that we do. So through working with CANDO, we're able to have individuals, in many cases, Indigenous economic development organizations in the regions, able to work directly with the businesses that are close at hand. One of the things that we've been doing as well, too, we've certainly been making use of distance technology and virtual to connect with our partners, but sometimes that doesn't always have the exact impact. So we'll start with virtual to establish contacts, and we will make the trip when it's necessary to actually be on the ground and present with partners. We know that there is a value in being able to deal with someone face to face. And then just to sort of pick up on the point that I think you alluded on, we do work very closely with the regional development agencies to leverage their expertise. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just note that CANDO is located in Alberta, is based in Alberta. So I'd be keen to know more about their activities in British Columbia, specifically Northwest BC. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.